This week on DeadPhilSunday, we're taking a look at the predicted value of data mining company Palantir. The Wall Street Journal has reported that the company is expected to be valued at $22 billion as it goes public next week. In a similar manner to many other tech companies, The Guardian explains that Palantir has never turned a profit. It lost $580 million in 2019. The first 6 months of 2020 showed improvement, however, with a $164 million loss compared to a $274 million deficit in the same period last year. End quote. The company predicts that in 2020 it will see a revenue growth of 42%. The ongoing global pandemic has been a source of loss for many companies and industries, specifically those operating on a much smaller scale. It is understandable to wonder how, when so many are losing so much, some are able to gain so much more. This week, then, we will be discussing how liberalism, which promotes the free market, makes it difficult to succeed along racial lines. In Capitalism and Freedom, Milton Friedman argues that within a free market economy, there is freedom from a person being discriminated against in their economic activities for reasons that are irrelevant to their productivity. End quote. This, however, has been proven to be historically inaccurate. The Berkeley Economic Review highlights that during the Jim Crow era, when the market was the least regulated, discrimination still thrived. This simply highlights that the free market has not been shown to actually discourage discrimination. Another criticism is that this analysis does not include less competitive markets or ones that hold monopolies. Citing the Berkeley Review again, if a firm were to discover a better search algorithm than the one Google currently employs, they still would not be able to compete with Google because the technical infrastructures needed to support internet searches is abhorrently expensive, which no small startup can afford. End quote. In the free market economy, then, discrimination does two things. First of all, it isolates and renders it hard for smaller, poorer, and marginalized communities to succeed. And second, it helps demarcate who is a targeted consumer, which ultimately can lead to higher profits. Thus, the market finds itself exploiting discrimination to better sell to its target consumers. The free market is a core value of the liberal state. That is to say, liberal in the philosophical sense of the word, rather than the American conception of liberal meaning simply progressive. Charles W. Mills explains that liberalism can take up many different forms. This is a break from the traditional ideology. He names 5 core characteristics of liberalism. Number 1, self-realization of individuals. This means the importance placed on the individual's ability to succeed. Number 2, social ontologies. The necessities for existing in society. Number 3, the mapping of source of the political. How do you think the political system is manifested? An example of this would be the family. Number 4, a theory of history. A general story of how we move from the pre-modern to the modern. And number 5, rights, protections, and freedom. What we determine is the way to best protect the first cause. Mills argues that all but the first characteristics can be transformed, thus forming different forms of liberalism. His explanation of why racism is so inherent within liberal societies boils down to the social position of the liberal. In a lecture he gives at the Simpson Center for the Humanities, he says that if the white male body of philosophers is writing about liberalism, then what is to be expected? End quote. Suggesting that the white male body defends the values that are important to his white male body only. He then goes on to say that the dominant varieties of liberalism have historically excluded the majority of the world's population. Why then, now that liberals are more exposed to racism, is it continuously ignored by them? Mills argues that the reason for this is that we have confused the actual historicity of race, that whilst we teach and often understand race to be a modern creation, beginning with colonialism, that it can actually be traced all the way back to some of the very first philosophers, namely Aristotle, who indeed states that some people are simply born slaves in reference to the Persians. But for Mills to acknowledge this is to change the way liberals and even Marxists have thought of race. It is to pull the thread that dismantles the general thought that racism emerges newly, whilst class divides exist always. What Mills is stating is that liberalism has until now misinterpreted, be it on purpose or not, the realities of history, and so that the liberalism we live under, the free market we understand to exist, is founded on a false theory of history, his fourth characteristic. Mills anticipates his critiques, both from the proud liberalist and the Marxist, in stating that the classic liberals will think of him bold to see an issue with an already perfect liberalism, and that the Marxists will view him as a traitor to the cause. What becomes clear with his work and the current political and financial crisis, though, is that the current system does not work, at least not well enough for most of the population. Thus, we must continue to read and analyze critical race theory and liberal theories and rebound them to history if we have hopes of moving towards a more just society, free market or not. This marks the end of the third episode of our DeadPhilSundays series. We hope you enjoyed it and that we'll see you next week.